The icy wind cuts through the concrete pier at Hoboken, New Jersey like a blade. It's March 1944, and the war-torn Atlantic has just delivered another cargo of human misery to American shores. But these aren't refugees seeking sanctuary. These are the enemy. Hans Weber stands naked and shivering in a line of equally terrified German prisoners, his 18-year-old frame trembling from more than just the bitter cold. His head has been shaved raw, leaving pale scalp exposed to the merciless wind whistling through the processing facility. Around him, hundreds of other German soldiers shuffle forward in a grotesque parade of defeat, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and something far worse, paralyzing fear. "Duschen!" barks an American guard, pointing toward a concrete doorway that seems to swallow the men ahead of them. Showers. Hans's stomach drops. Every muscle in his body locks with terror. The Nazi propaganda films flash through his mind, stories his officers told about American brutality, about what happens to captured German soldiers. They castrate prisoners, his sergeant had whispered during those final desperate weeks in Italy. They torture you until you beg for death. The line moves forward with mechanical inevitability. Hans watches the man in front of him, a grizzled Wehrmacht veteran twice his age, begin to shake uncontrollably. The older soldier's lips move in what might be prayer, or perhaps just the mindless repetition of a name, a memory of someone he'll never see again. "Was werden sie mit uns machen?" the veteran whispers. "What will they do to us?" Hans has no answer. None of them do. They've been told they're entering hell on earth, that American prisons are death camps where German soldiers disappear forever. The propaganda painted America as a nation of savage capitalists who would work prisoners to death in brutal labor camps, a broken country ravaged by their own war economy. As Hans approaches the concrete doorway, he can hear the sound of rushing water from inside. Steam billows out like smoke from some industrial furnace. His heart hammers against his ribs so hard he's certain it will burst. At 18, he's already seen more death than most men witness in a lifetime. The retreat through Italy, watching his friends die in muddy foxholes. The desperate final battle where American forces overwhelm their position. But this feels different. This feels like the end of everything. The guard gestures for Hans to step forward. Through the steam and fear, he catches glimpses of other prisoners inside, alive, moving, washing themselves, not screaming, not dying, just cleaning. But Hans Weber, product of Nazi indoctrination and propaganda, terrified teenager in enemy hands, cannot yet comprehend what his eyes are showing him. How could he possibly know that he's not entering a chamber of horrors, but the first step in a journey that will completely shatter everything he thought he knew about America, about his enemies, and about the true meaning of humanity in wartime? How could any of them know that they were about to discover something that would change their lives forever? To understand the shock that awaited these German prisoners, you have to grasp the world they came from. A world painted in stark propaganda and shaped by Nazi lies about their American enemies. Hans Weber had grown up in a Germany where every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every school lesson hammered home the same message: America was weak, decadent, and falling apart. The propaganda ministry showed films of breadlines during the Depression, of racial violence, of a nation torn apart by its own contradictions. American soldiers, they were told, were soft city boys who would crumble at the first sign of real fighting. But the propaganda went darker when it came to what happened to German soldiers who fell into American hands. Hans remembered the whispered stories in the barracks, how Americans tortured prisoners for information, how they worked captured Germans to death in brutal labor camps, how no German soldier who surrendered to Americans was ever seen again. The fear was so pervasive that many German units fought to the death rather than surrender, believing capture meant something worse than dying on the battlefield. As the transport ship Monticello carried Hans and 3,000 other prisoners across the Atlantic in early 1944, these fears multiplied in the cramped holds below deck. Men who had survived the Africa Corps desert campaigns, who had endured the hell of Italy, now faced their greatest terror: life as prisoners in enemy hands. "They'll put us in cages like animals," whispered Klaus, a panzer commander from Hans's unit who had lost his left arm to American artillery. "Work us in their factories until we drop dead." Another prisoner, a Luftwaffe pilot named Werner, shook his head grimly. "If we're lucky, they'll just shoot us." I heard they're running experiments on German prisoners, testing chemicals, diseases. The stories grew more horrific with each telling. In the darkness of the ship's hold, fear became a living thing that fed on itself, growing stronger with every day at sea. These weren't just random terrors. They were the product of years of systematic Nazi propaganda designed to make German soldiers fight harder by convincing them that surrender meant a fate worse than death. But then something happened that no amount of Nazi propaganda had prepared them for. The train. After the delousing and processing at Hoboken, Hans found himself boarding what he expected to be a cattle car bound for some American gulag. Instead, he stepped into something that seemed impossible: a passenger train with padded seats that reclined, with windows he could actually see through, with access to clean bathrooms whenever he needed them. And then came the food. Hans stared in disbelief at the tray placed in front of him. Hot beef stew, fresh bread, real butter, and something he'd never tasted before: a strange, sweet, brown paste the American guards called peanut butter. After years of ersatz coffee, sawdust bread, and watery soup that passed for meals in the German army, this feast seemed like a hallucination. "This can't be real," Werner muttered, taking careful bites as if the food might poison him. "It's too good. They're fattening us up for something." But Klaus, the one-armed panzer commander, was staring out the window with growing amazement. "Look at the farms," he whispered. "Look at the machines, the tractors, the buildings. Everything is intact." Hans pressed his face to the glass and felt his understanding of the world begin to crack. This wasn't the bombed-out wasteland of American industrial failure they'd been told about. This was a country that looked more prosperous than Germany had ever been, even before the war. Massive factories hummed with activity, their smokestacks pointing toward a sky unmarked by bomb craters. Farmlands stretched endlessly, worked by machines larger and more advanced than anything he'd seen in Europe. "Where are the ruins?" Hans asked quietly. "Where are the starving people?" The propaganda had promised them they would see a nation brought to its knees by war, a people suffering under the boot of their capitalist oppressors. Instead, through the train windows, they saw abundance everywhere: full grain silos, fat cattle, workers who looked well-fed and healthy. American cities passed by with electric lights blazing even in daytime, cars filling streets in numbers that seemed impossible to German eyes accustomed to wartime rationing. As the train rolled westward toward their unknown destination, something even more unsettling began to happen. The American guards, the brutal, savage captors they'd been warned about, started treating them not like dangerous enemies, but like people. "You boys okay back there?" asked Sergeant Murphy, a middle-aged guard from Boston whose own son was fighting somewhere in the Pacific. "Need anything? More water?" The casual kindness in his voice was more terrifying to Hans than any threat could have been. This wasn't how enemies were supposed to behave. Where was the hatred? Where was the cruelty they'd been promised? When Klaus mentioned that his wounded arm was hurting, Sergeant Murphy didn't ignore him or mock his pain. Instead, he radioed ahead to ensure medical attention would be waiting at the next stop. When Werner asked hesitantly about news from the war, Murphy didn't snarl or threaten. He simply said, "Your families back home are going to be glad you made it through alive, son." By the time their train pulled into the station at Camp Algona, Iowa, Hans Weber's worldview was already beginning to crumble. Everything he'd been told, everything he'd believed about America and Americans was proving to be a lie. But he had no idea that the biggest shock was still waiting for him. The shock of discovering that in America, even prisoners of war got paid for their work. Camp Algona, Iowa, sprawls across the prairie like a small city that materialized overnight. As Hans Weber steps off the transport truck on that crisp April morning in 1944, he's expecting to see the American gulag he's been dreading, watchtowers bristling with machine guns, barbed wire electrified to kill, guards with attack dogs ready to tear apart any prisoner who steps out of line. Instead, what greets him looks almost suburban. The barracks are clean wooden buildings with actual windows. Prisoners walk freely within the compound, some playing soccer on a real grass field, others tending what appears to be a vegetable garden. Through the fence, he can see American farmland stretching to the horizon, not the industrial wasteland of Nazi propaganda, but rich black soil that speaks of abundance. "We'll come in Iowa," says the camp commander, Major Thompson, in surprisingly good German. "Welcome to Iowa. You'll find things here are probably different from what you expected." Different doesn't begin to cover it. Hans is assigned to Barrack 7, where his bunkmate turns out to be Friedrich, a former engineering student from Munich who's been at Algona for 3 months. As Hans stows his few possessions in a clean footlocker, his own footlocker, Friedrich begins explaining the impossible reality of American prisoner of war camps. "They feed us 3 hot meals a day," Friedrich says, his voice still tinged with disbelief. "Real meat, fresh vegetables, white bread. The Americans eat the same food we do. Prisoners and guards, same kitchen." Hans stares at him. In the German army, officers ate better than enlisted men, and everyone ate better than prisoners. The idea that American guards would share identical meals with German POWs seems to violate the natural order of warfare. "And they have a library," Friedrich continues, warming to his subject. "Books in German and English. They show movies on Saturday nights, American films, Charlie Chaplin, even some German films that aren't Nazi propaganda. They have musical instruments if you want to join the camp orchestra." "You're lying," Hans says flatly. "This is some kind of trick." Friedrich's response is to pull out a small booklet and hand it to Hans. It's printed in both German and English. Camp Algona, Prisoner Regulations and Guidelines. Hans scans the pages with growing amazement. Recreation time, educational opportunities, religious services, medical care equal to that provided American soldiers. And then he sees something that makes him certain he's hallucinating. Article 27, Prisoner Labor and Compensation, he reads aloud. "All able-bodied prisoners assigned to work detail shall receive compensation at the rate of 80 cents per day, paid in camp script, redeemable at the camp store, or held in trust for post-war. Repatriation." Hans looks up at Friedrich. They pay us." 80 cents a day, Friedrich nods. "The Geneva Convention requires it, and the Americans follow the Geneva Convention to the letter. More than follow it, they exceed it." The next morning, Hans reports for his first work assignment. Farm labor with John Henley, whose 160-acre farm sits just 3 miles from the camp. As the truck carrying 6 German POWs pulls up to the Henley farmhouse, Hans expects to be herded out at gunpoint and forced into back-breaking labor under the watchful eyes of armed guards. Instead, John Henley walks up to the truck with a thermos of coffee and a smile. "Morning, boys," he says in English, then switches to broken but earnest German. "Guten Morgen." "Kaffee?" He offers them coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute they've known for years. Hans accepts a cup with trembling hands, unable to process what's happening. This American farmer, whose sons are presumably fighting Germans somewhere in Europe, is offering enemy prisoners coffee like their neighbors dropping by for a visit. "Today we're planting corn," Henley explains through the translator. "I'll show you how we do it here in Iowa. Work hard, and there's lunch at noon. My wife makes the best fried chicken in 3 counties, and at day's end, you each get your 80 cents. The work is hard, but not brutal. Hans has worked farms before, but never with machinery like this. John Deere tractors that can plant 6 rows at once, equipment that makes German farming tools look primitive by comparison. As the morning progresses, something even more remarkable happens. John Henley begins treating the German prisoners not as enemies, but as fellow farmers learning a new trade. "Hans, isn't it?" Henley says during a break, having learned the young German's name. "You ever worked with hybrid seed corn before?" "No." "Well, let me show you something." For the next 20 minutes, this American farmer, whose country is at war with Germany, gives Hans Weber a detailed lesson in crop rotation, soil management, and agricultural techniques that are decades ahead of anything Hans has seen in Europe. Not because he has to, not because anyone ordered him to, but simply because he's a farmer talking to another person who's interested in farming. At lunch, Hans finds himself sitting at John Henley's kitchen table, eating fried chicken with the farmer's wife, Martha, who fusses over the German prisoners like they're her own sons far from home. "You boys eat up," she insists, piling more chicken on Hans's plate. "You're skin and bones. Don't they feed you properly in that army of yours?" Hans wants to explain that there hasn't been proper food in the German army for months, that they've been living on turnip soup and black bread when they could get it. But the words won't come. All he can do is eat the best meal he's had in years, while this American woman, whose own boys are fighting in France, treats enemy prisoners with more kindness than many Germans show their own neighbors. And then comes the moment that shatters Hans Weber's worldview completely. At day's end, as the prisoners prepare to return to camp, John Henley walks up to each of them with something in his hand. Money. Real American money, 80 cents per man, just as promised. Hans stares at the coins in his palm, 3 quarters and a nickel, as if they're artifacts from an alien civilization. In his 18 years, through all his Nazi indoctrination, through every propaganda film about American brutality, no one ever told him that Americans would pay enemy prisoners for honest work. "Same time tomorrow?" Henley asked with a smile. "We've got more planting to do." That night, Hans lies in his clean bunk in his heated barracks, staring at the 80 cents in his palm. Around him, other prisoners share their own stories of the day, working in vegetable gardens, helping with construction projects, some even working in the camp kitchen. All of them paid. All of them treated with a dignity that German prisoners in Soviet camps could never imagine. "Friedrich," Hans whispers to his bunkmate, "what if everything they told us about Americans was wrong?" Friedrich is quiet for a long moment. "I've been thinking the same thing," he finally admits. "My father always said Americans were soft, weak people who couldn't fight a real war. But look around us, Hans. This is how they treat their enemies. What kind of strength does it take to show kindness to people who were trying to kill you just weeks ago?" Through the barracks window, Hans can see the American guards making their evening rounds. Instead of the brutal overseers of Nazi propaganda, they look like ordinary men doing an ordinary job. fathers and sons and brothers who probably want nothing more than for this war to end so they can go home to their own families. As Hans finally drifts off to sleep, holding his first honest wages in his clenched fist, he has no way of knowing that this single day has changed him forever. He doesn't yet understand that he's witnessed something that will reshape his understanding of humanity, of what it means to be civilized in an uncivilized world. He only knows that tomorrow he'll go back to John Henley's farm, do honest work, and earn honest pay from people who have every reason to hate him but choose kindness instead. And somewhere deep in his 18-year-old heart, a seed of something new is beginning to grow, something that will eventually bring him back to America not as a prisoner, but as a man seeking the kind of life where enemies can become friends and dignity is afforded to all. 6 months later, Hans Weber stands in the same Hoboken processing center where his American journey began, but everything has changed. The terrified teenager who once trembled at the sound of rushing water in the showers is now a young man whose world has been turned inside out by the radical act of human decency. In his pocket, he carries $127.50, his accumulated wages from 6 months of farm work at 80 cents per day. It's more money than most German civilians will see in the war's aftermath. But more importantly, it represents something no Nazi propaganda film ever prepared him for. Proof that America kept its word, even to its enemies. The transformation wasn't unique to Hans. Across America's 500-plus POW camps, similar stories played out daily. German prisoners who arrived expecting torture camps found themselves in what many called der goldener Käfig, the golden cage. They discovered Americans who followed the Geneva Convention not just in letter, but in spirit, treating captured enemies with a dignity that left profound psychological scars on Nazi ideology. Consider the broader impact. Of the 400,000-plus German POWs held in America, fewer than 1% attempted escape. Not because escape was impossible, but because many didn't want to leave. Some, like Georg Gertner, actually escaped and chose to remain in America illegally for decades rather than return to war-torn Germany. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual transformations. As word spread through German ranks about American treatment of prisoners, surrender rates increased dramatically. German soldiers began actively seeking capture by American forces rather than Soviet troops, knowing they faced dignity rather than death in American hands. This intelligence advantage shortened battles and saved lives on both sides. But perhaps the most powerful testament to American prisoner treatment lies in what happened after the war ended. Hans Weber was among thousands of former German POWs who applied to return to America as immigrants. He married an American woman he met through correspondence, relationships that began when former prisoners wrote to thank American families who had shown them kindness. These marriages were so common that the U.S. government created special programs to facilitate them, with war bride ships carrying American women to Europe for weddings, then bringing newlywed couples back to start new lives. The economic impact was equally profound. Those accumulated wages, millions of dollars earned by German POWs, flowed back into Germany's devastated post-war economy. While American taxpayers fed, housed, and paid German prisoners, those prisoners' wages helped rebuild the very nation America had fought to defeat. It was capitalism and compassion working hand in hand, a Marshall Plan that began before the war even ended. The contrast with other nations' treatment of POWs couldn't be starker. While German POWs in America gained weight and earned money, German prisoners in Soviet camps faced starvation, forced labor, and death rates exceeding 30%. American prisoners of war in German camps endured harsh conditions, but those held by Japan faced unspeakable brutality. America's adherence to Geneva Convention standards created a moral high ground that influenced international treatment of prisoners for generations. Today, as modern conflicts raise questions about prisoner treatment and human rights, the World War II German POW program offers crucial lessons. It demonstrated that treating enemies with dignity doesn't weaken a nation. It strengthens it. It showed that following international law, even when adversaries don't, creates strategic advantages that pure military force cannot achieve. The personal stories continue to resonate. Hans Weber returned to Iowa in 1952, became an American citizen, and farmed the same land where he once worked as a prisoner. John Henley became his business partner, then his lifelong friend. At Henley's funeral in 1978, Hans gave the eulogy, speaking of the American farmer who taught a young German prisoner that enemies could become family. Similar stories played out across America. Former prisoners became teachers, doctors, engineers, and farmers, contributing to the very society they once fought against. Their children and grandchildren are American citizens whose family histories embody the nation's capacity for forgiveness and transformation. The lesson transcends history. In a world where conflicts seem intractable and enemies appear irredeemable, America's World War II prisoner program proves that treating adversaries with dignity and respect isn't naive idealism. It's strategic wisdom that can transform enemies into allies, hatred into understanding, and defeat into redemption. Hans Weber died in 2003, an American citizen who lived to see former enemies become NATO allies. In his final interview, he was asked what surprised him most about America. His answer was simple: that they kept their promise to pay us 80 cents a day. When someone keeps their word to their enemies, you know they're people you can trust with your life. That's the power of treating enemies like human beings, because sometimes they become Americans. Ready to dive deeper into untold World War II stories? Subscribe now and discover how individual moments of humanity changed the course of history, one person at a time. What other enemy stories from World War II would surprise you? Let me know in the comments below.